It was an ordinary morning in Los Angeles. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft glow over the city's skyline as Keanu Reeves stepped out of his quiet apartment, coffee in hand. The streets were still relatively empty, just the calm before the storm of a typical LA day. For most people, this would be a time to prepare for a busy day ahead. For Keanu, it was a rare moment to savor a little peace. He slid into his old beat-up car, a vintage 1994 Ford Mustang, one of the few possessions he truly cared about. It was an oddity in the world of luxury cars and flashy high-end rides that often surrounded Hollywood stars. But for Keanu, it was a symbol of normalcy, something he could hold on to in a life full of glitter and glam. Keanu started the engine, the familiar rumble filling the air. He was about to drive down to his favorite café, one that was tucked away in a corner of the city where the paparazzi couldn't find him. He wasn't in the mood for the limelight today, just coffee, maybe a book, and a few moments of calm. But as he pulled into the parking lot, something felt off. A police car was parked nearby, its flashing lights softly illuminating the pavement. Keanu paused for a moment, raising an eyebrow. It wasn't unusual to see police around, but this one seemed different. The officer standing by the car wasn't focused on anything else. His eyes were locked on Keanu's vehicle. Keanu shrugged it off, assuming it was just a coincidence. He opened the door and stepped out, holding his coffee cup. But before he could take a step, the officer approached him with a stern look on his face. "Sir," the officer said firmly, "I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the vehicle." Keanu looked at him, confused. "Is something wrong?" The officer glanced over at the car, then back at Keanu, his expression unreadable. "We've received reports that this vehicle is stolen, and you fit the description of the person who stole it." Keanu stood frozen for a moment, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Stolen? This car is mine. I've had it for years." The officer didn't budge. "I'm going to have to verify that with the system. Until then, I'll need you to stay here." Keanu felt his heart rate increase slightly, but he remained calm. The officer was just doing his job, after all. But this was something he hadn't expected. Not in a million years. How could this be happening? His mind raced, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. "Can you check again?" Keanu asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I've had this car forever." The officer pulled out his phone and began typing. Keanu could see the frustration building in his face. The officer had to check multiple times, his fingers tapping rapidly across the screen, before he glanced back up at Keanu with an even deeper look of suspicion. "I don't know what's going on," the officer muttered under his breath. "But the system doesn't lie." Keanu glanced at his car again, trying to wrap his mind around the situation. This was unreal. How could his own car be flagged as stolen? He had never been in trouble with the law. He had never stolen anything in his life. It didn't make sense. "Look, officer," Keanu said, trying to stay calm. "I have all the paperwork for the car. I can prove it's mine." The officer raised a skeptical eyebrow. "We'll see about that." As the officer started taking more details from Keanu, a small crowd had begun to gather. A few people on the sidewalk were starting to notice the scene, their phones already in hand, ready to capture whatever was about to unfold. Keanu could feel the tension in the air, like something was brewing just beneath the surface. "What is happening?" Keanu thought, a familiar feeling of unease creeping up his spine. This wasn't just any encounter. This was turning into something bigger. Would Keanu, a Hollywood icon, really be accused of something so absurd? What was the real story behind the claim? And more importantly, would he be able to prove his innocence before things spiraled further out of control? Before he could gather his thoughts, the officer spoke again. "Sir, I'm afraid I'm going to have to detain you until we figure this out." Keanu's mind raced. Detain me? For my own car? And in that moment he realized his calm morning was no longer just a peaceful start to the day. It was the beginning of something much bigger. 1. Happens next, Keanu wondered. Keanu Reeves was used to the weirdness of fame. He had dealt with paparazzi following him, fans approaching him in the streets, and the occasional bizarre situation that came with being a well-known actor. But this was something else entirely. As he stood there facing a police officer, accusing him of stealing his own car, Keanu could hardly believe what was happening. The situation was surreal, a mix of confusion, frustration, and disbelief. For the most part, Keanu's life had been defined by a strange blend of normalcy and stardom. He had always chosen to live outside the limelight, often rejecting the Hollywood party scene in favor of quieter, more grounded experiences. People who knew him personally often described him as humble almost to a fault. Despite being a global movie star, Keanu had never let the fame get to his head. He lived in a modest home, drove an unassuming car, and spent his free time helping others, in ways that often went unnoticed. He didn't need the glitz and glam of Hollywood to validate his existence. But today it seemed as though the universe was playing some cruel joke. Flashback: Keanu's humble beginnings, Keanu's journey to Hollywood fame, had been nothing like the stories of most of his peers. Born in Beirut, Lebanon, and raised in Toronto, Canada, Keanu had always known the importance of hard work, dedication, and staying grounded. He wasn't born into a privileged family. His mother was a costume designer, and his father was mostly absent from his life. As a result, Keanu had learned early on to navigate life with resilience and independence. Growing up, he spent hours working on his passion for acting, but it wasn't until he was a teenager that he truly found his calling. Despite his early career setbacks, including a few small roles in TV shows that didn't take off, Keanu persevered. It wasn't until Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure that he began to make a name for himself. But even as his career skyrocketed, Keanu remained deeply connected to his roots. He didn't fall prey to the excesses of Hollywood life, choosing instead to live simply. He didn't have a collection of extravagant cars, nor did he live in one of the multi-million-dollar mansions in Beverly Hills. Instead, Keanu had opted for a modest home, a quiet life, and a select group of friends. And there, in front of him, was the very car that had symbolized his grounded nature. His beloved 1994 Ford Mustang, a car he had bought years ago for its unpretentiousness. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't a sports car that screamed wealth. It was simply a reflection of who he was: humble, low-key, and unassuming. Keanu's connection to the Mustang was deep. He had driven it across the country during filming for The Matrix and other movies. The car had been with him through the ups and downs, the highs and lows of his career. It was his escape, his one piece of normalcy. But today that connection was now tangled up in a bizarre accusation: the officer's unwavering stance. The officer, whose name was Officer Daniels, continued to scan the vehicle, his fingers scrolling over his phone. Keanu, still in disbelief, tried to stay calm, reminding himself that he had dealt with stranger situations. But this was different. "I really need to stress that you're not in any trouble, Mr. Reeves," Officer Daniels said, his tone now softening slightly. "But I do need to verify this. We can't let this situation go without checking things out thoroughly." Keanu nodded, swallowing hard as the cold grip of confusion tightened around him. How had this happened? How could the car, a piece of his life that he'd owned for years, be flagged as stolen? "I understand," Keanu said quietly, still holding onto his coffee cup as if it might somehow ground him. He ran a hand through his hair. "But it's really my car. I've had it since before The Matrix." Officer Daniels hesitated, glancing up from his phone with an expression that hinted at both skepticism and frustration. "The thing is, Mr. Reeves," he said a little more earnestly now, "the vehicle identification number, VIN, matches one reported stolen 2 weeks ago. Everything checks out except, well, you." Keanu's stomach dropped. "The owner of the car that was stolen had a different description," Officer Daniels continued. "But the VIN's a perfect match. It's a rare model, especially in the city, and, well, you're Keanu Reeves, a celebrity. It makes sense why you'd be the one to drive it. But we need to be sure." Keanu felt a pang of anger rising in him. It wasn't the officer's fault, but the very idea of being falsely accused of stealing his own car was maddening. He didn't want to make the situation worse, so he held his tongue and tried to remain calm. But deep down, he knew something didn't add up. As the officer continued typing into his phone, a small crowd of bystanders began to gather. It started with a couple of people on their morning jog. Then a few more curious faces appeared from nearby businesses. Phones were raised, cameras flashing. Keanu could feel the eyes of the world on him, even if they were just a handful of curious onlookers. It wasn't the first time this had happened. In fact, it was probably just the beginning, but this was different. This wasn't a red carpet. This wasn't a photo op. This was real life. For the first time in a long while, Keanu's fame wasn't a blessing. It was a curse. People were beginning to whisper. Some were already guessing that this was some publicity stunt, a prank, or maybe even an attempt at a lawsuit. But none of those things were true. Keanu wasn't trying to get attention. He wasn't trying to make a scene. He was simply trying to figure out what had gone so wrong. As he stood there trying to calm himself, the officer returned from his phone with a grim expression. "We've got a problem, Mr. Reeves," Officer Daniels said quietly. Keanu's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "There's been a mix-up with the records. It looks like your car was used in some kind of scam, a car theft ring. Someone swapped the VIN numbers, and we've only just caught it." Keanu was stunned. The idea that his car was caught up in a criminal operation, let alone something as bizarre as this, was too much to process. How could this happen, he wondered. The officer's next words only deepened the confusion. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reeves, but we need to take the car in for further investigation. It's protocol." Keanu's mind raced. There was no way this was real. How could his car, the one he trusted, be part of something criminal? But he knew there was little he could do at the moment. His head spinning, he nodded. "I understand," he replied, his voice tight, "but I want to make one thing clear. I'm not going anywhere without my car." Keanu's stomach churned as he stood beside Officer Daniels, his mind spinning. The officer's words echoed in his ears, car theft ring and swapped VIN numbers. He could hardly grasp the gravity of the situation. His beloved 1994 Ford Mustang, a car he had kept for years, was now at the center of a crime investigation. The officer's request to take the car in for further investigation felt like a punch in the gut. Keanu had always been an advocate for doing things by the book, for being patient, for trusting the process. But this was something else. How could something so mundane as a car be dragged into a scam? The crowd, still gathered at a distance, whispered among themselves. Some seemed genuinely concerned, while others, familiar with Keanu's reputation, likely assumed this was just another weird Hollywood moment. Keanu's name had been associated with countless rumors over the years. He was known for his kindness and humility, but his career had also been marked by bizarre tabloid stories that often bordered on the absurd. But this was something different. Keanu didn't know what to do. He couldn't just let this slide. His Mustang, the one car that had been his constant companion through decades of fame, was now a pawn in a game he didn't understand. "Mr. Reeves," Officer Daniels spoke again, his voice steady but professional. "I know this might be frustrating, but we need to take your vehicle for further analysis. We'll get everything sorted out, I assure you." Keanu nodded. He didn't want to escalate the situation, especially in front of the small crowd that was beginning to grow. He had learned the hard way that public perceptions could spiral out of control in an instant. Still, his heart raced as he watched Officer Daniels call in the tow truck. The Mustang would be taken away, along with all the questions and confusion that followed. After the tow truck hauled the Mustang away, Keanu stood by his apartment, staring at the empty parking spot where his car had been moments ago. His coffee, now lukewarm in his hand, did little to comfort him. He was left alone in the strange quiet of his thoughts. A few hours later, Keanu sat down at his kitchen table, scrolling through the few pieces of information he had gathered. The stolen car scam, the VIN swap, the confusion over the identity of the car's owner. Nothing about this made sense. How could someone have gotten their hands on his car and altered its details without him noticing? Keanu knew one thing for certain. He needed answers. He picked up the phone and dialed a number. He knew by heart. It was Rick, his trusted personal investigator, someone who had helped him out in the past with everything from simple legal matters to personal issues. Rick was a no-nonsense guy, sharp, methodical, and most importantly, discreet. If anyone could get to the bottom of this, it was him. "Rick," Keanu said, his voice tight, "I need your help. Something's happened. My car's been flagged as stolen." Rick's voice came through the phone with a hint of surprise, but quickly shifted to concern. "What? Your Mustang?" "Yeah," Keanu replied. "The police are investigating it as part of some kind of car theft ring. They say the VIN was swapped and now they're treating me like a suspect." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Keanu could hear Rick processing the information, the gears turning in his mind. "That's strange. Are you sure about all this? VIN swap, stolen car ring, sounds like something out of a bad movie." "I know," Keanu said, "but the car's gone and I'm stuck with a bunch of unanswered questions. I need you to dig into this. I want to know who's behind it and how my car ended up in the middle of it." Rick was quiet for a moment before answering. "All right, I'll look into it. I'll need some time, but I'll start calling around. Just sit tight for now, Keanu. We'll get to the bottom of this." Keanu sighed in relief, but it didn't last long. His thoughts returned to the car, the way it had been taken away without any clear explanation. His Mustang wasn't just a car, it was part of his identity, and now it had been thrust into a mess that threatened to unravel everything. Over the next few days, Keanu kept a low profile. The press, ever hungry for a new angle, had caught wind of the strange situation, but they didn't have much to go on yet. A few sensational headlines made their rounds, but Keanu knew better than to pay attention to the media circus. What mattered now was the investigation, both his own and Rick's. Keanu stayed in touch with his investigator, and slowly, pieces of the puzzle started to come together. It turned out that the Mustang had, in fact, been involved in a much larger criminal operation than anyone could have guessed. Rick had uncovered a ring of car thieves who specialized in swapping VIN numbers on stolen vehicles, making them nearly impossible to trace. Keanu's Mustang had been targeted by these criminals, likely because of its unique and rare status. They had somehow swapped out the original VIN for a fake one, making it look like a completely different car. What made the situation even more bizarre was that Keanu's vehicle hadn't been stolen from him directly. Instead, it had been part of a larger scheme where the criminals had somehow intercepted and altered the car's details before anyone realized it was missing. Rick had also uncovered something even stranger. Someone had planted the Mustang at the scene of a car theft bust just days before the police flagged it. It was clear that someone had gone to great lengths to make sure Keanu's car was implicated in this crime. Keanu could hardly believe what he was hearing. This wasn't just a random mistake or a case of mistaken identity. His car had been used as part of an elaborate scam, one that had been carefully orchestrated by people who knew exactly what they were doing. As the days passed, Keanu continued to piece together the strange web of deception that had led to this bizarre situation. But it wasn't until one fateful phone call from Rick that things began to make sense in a way Keanu never expected. "Keanu," Rick's voice came through the phone, sounding tense. "I think I know who's behind all of this." Keanu's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" he asked. Rick paused for a long moment. "It's someone close to you. Someone who's been in your circle." Keanu's mind went blank. "Someone close to me." The answer was a shock that would change everything. Keanu stood still, his hand gripping the phone tightly as he processed Rick's words. Someone close to him. The idea felt like a punch to the gut. He had trusted many people over the years, keeping his inner circle tight: family, a few close friends, and trusted colleagues. Who could it be? And why would someone he knew be involved? Then something so twisted. The silence on the other end of the line stretched as if Rick was letting the weight of his statement sink in. "Rick." "Who?" Keanu's voice was barely a whisper. Rick exhaled slowly. "It's complicated, Keanu. I've been digging into your past connections and I found something. Remember Jason, your old mechanic, the one who worked on your Mustang all those years ago?" Keanu's heart skipped a beat. Jason. It had been years since he had thought about him. Jason had been a good guy, trusted, reliable, and one of the few people who had consistently worked on his car. The two had bonded over cars and shared a mutual respect for their love of machinery. Keanu had always admired how Jason seemed to have an intuitive understanding of what his Mustang needed, never overcharging him, and always keeping things under the radar. They'd even shared a few beers after work, talking about the good old days. But the more Keanu thought about it, the more unsettling the pieces started to fall into place. Jason had vanished from his life a couple of years ago after a personal crisis, disappearing without a trace. At the time, Keanu had assumed it was a family matter, something private. But now, hearing Rick's voice over the phone, it was beginning to feel like there was more to the story. Keanu's voice tightened with suspicion. "Are you saying Jason's behind this? That he's the one who swapped the VIN?" Rick paused again before responding. "I don't know for sure, Keanu, but I've found traces of his name connected to some shady business dealings. I'm not talking about simple car repairs here. Jason got involved with a group that specializes in stolen car rings, and your Mustang, Keanu's, it looks like it was targeted by them." Keanu's mind raced. Jason? The idea was unthinkable. How could someone he had known so well, someone he had trusted, be involved in something so underhanded? Are you saying that Jason, he was working with these criminals? Or worse, that he was using me as a pawn? "It's still unclear," Rick said cautiously. "But his name keeps coming up, and I've traced some of the ownership documents back to him. If I'm right, this wasn't just a random act. Someone with access to your vehicle did this on purpose. I can't give you the full details yet, but I think you need to confront him, see if he knows anything." Keanu felt a chill run through him. The thought of confronting Jason, someone who had once been a friend, filled him with a sense of dread. But Rick was right. If there was any hope of clearing his name and understanding what had happened, he needed answers, even if those answers hurt. The next day, Keanu drove to the last address he had for Jason, hoping that his old friend would be there. It was a small, unassuming house tucked away on a quiet street, the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen. The front lawn was overgrown with weeds, and the mailbox hung crookedly, a reflection of the neglect the house had endured. Keanu parked his car across the street and sat there for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what he would say. He wasn't even sure how to approach this conversation. Could he even trust what Jason said? Would he admit to his involvement, or would he lie to protect himself? Taking a deep breath, Keanu stepped out of the car and walked toward the house. He knocked on the door, his knuckles tapping lightly but firmly. For a moment there was silence, and then Keanu heard footsteps approaching from inside. The door creaked open, revealing Jason, looking a little disheveled, as if he hadn't been expecting visitors. His eyes widened when he saw Keanu standing. "On the other side, Keanu?" Jason said, his voice filled with surprise. "What are you doing here?" Keanu forced a smile, but it felt strained. "I need to talk to you, Jason. It's about the Mustang." Jason's expression immediately darkened, his eyes darting nervously. Keanu could feel the tension building in the air, thick and uncomfortable. There was something in Jason's reaction that set Keanu's instincts on edge. "I don't think there's anything to talk about," Jason said, his voice growing defensive. "You should have stayed away from all of this." Keanu's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about? My car was stolen, Jason. And it's not just any theft. Someone swapped the VIN numbers and now the cops think I'm involved in a car." "Theft ring? You know something about this, don't you?" Jason looked away, his jaw clenching as he struggled to find the words. "Keanu, I never meant for any of this to happen. I swear." Keanu's heart sank as he heard the tremor in Jason's voice. It was clear now that Jason wasn't denying involvement. He was just trying to cover up something much bigger. "Jason, I need you to be honest with me. Were you part of this? Did you set me up?" Keanu's voice was firm now, the frustration and betrayal creeping into his words. He wasn't going to back down. Jason hesitated for a long moment before he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. I got in over my head, Keanu. I didn't think it would get to you. They made me do it. Those people, they threatened me." Keanu's heart pounded in his chest as Jason's words began to make sense, but they only left him with more questions. "Who made you do it, Jason? Who are these people?" Keanu asked urgently, his voice growing more intense. Jason looked terrified, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid someone might be listening. "I can't say. They'll come for me if I do." Keanu stepped forward, his voice more pleading now. "Jason, you need to tell me who's behind this. You need to help me clear my name. Jason shook his head. I can't. I've already said too much. Suddenly, before Keanu could respond, Jason slammed the door in his face. Keanu stood there, staring at the door, his mind reeling. Jason had just confirmed everything, but in the worst possible way. He was involved, but not by choice. He had been forced into this. But by whom? And why? There was no turning back now. Keanu needed to find out who was behind this crime ring, and he couldn't do it alone. He turned and walked back to his car, feeling the weight of betrayal heavier than ever. His friend had become a pawn in something far darker than Keanu had ever imagined. Now the race was on to uncover the full truth. Who was behind this scheme, and what would Keanu have to sacrifice to finally bring the truth to light? Keanu could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him as he sat in his car, staring at Jason's door. The conversation had left him shaken, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just learned. Jason had been forced into this criminal operation, an operation that, unbeknownst to Keanu, had been lurking in the shadows for far too long. But who was behind it, and why had they targeted him? The questions hung in the air like a thick fog, clouding his thoughts. Jason's words echoed in his mind. They made me do it, those people. Who were they? Who were the ones pulling the strings in this dangerous game? Keanu knew that he couldn't just walk away from this. His reputation, his peace of mind, and most importantly, his car, his beloved Mustang were on the line. If he was going to clear his name, he needed to dive deeper into the mystery. He couldn't trust Jason anymore, not with the way the man had shut him out. But there had to be someone who could help him unravel this dark web. Keanu pulled out his phone and dialed Rick's number once more. He needed to know more, to get a better understanding of who he was up against. Rick answered on the second ring, his voice steady as always. Keanu, what's going on? I talked to Jason, Keanu said, his voice heavy. He confirmed it. He was involved, but not willingly. He said there are people behind this, people who made him do it, but he won't say who they are. Rick was quiet for a moment, processing what Keanu had said. So it's worse than we thought. This isn't just some car theft operation. This is part of something bigger. We're dealing with organized crime here. Keanu's stomach tightened. The reality of what he was dealing with was starting to sink in. I need to know who these people are, Rick. I need to find out everything. They're using Jason, and now they've used my car. I can't let this go any longer. Rick's voice softened, his concern palpable. All right, I'll dig deeper, Keanu. I've got some contacts I can reach out to, but it's going to take some time. This kind of thing isn't easy to uncover, especially if we're dealing with a network of criminals who know how to cover their tracks. Keanu nodded, even though Rick couldn't see him. I don't have much time, Rick. I need answers, and I need them fast. I'll do what I can, Rick said. But be careful, Keanu. Whoever is behind this is dangerous, and if they've already gone to these lengths to mess with you, who knows what they're capable of? Keanu's jaw clenched. He had been in dangerous situations before. He wasn't naive to the darker side of the world. But this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about taking down a criminal network that had used him as a pawn, all while playing games with his life. Over the next few days, Keanu received word from Rick. His investigation was making progress, but it wasn't fast. Rick had managed to trace some of the criminal operations to a well-known underground syndicate that had been operating in the region for years. The group, known as the Silver Serpents, had a reputation for being ruthless, with a vast network of car thieves, smugglers, and corrupt officials who helped them cover their tracks. They specialized in stealing high-end vehicles, altering their identities, and selling them on the black market. What shocked Keanu the most was how deeply embedded the syndicate was in the local community. They had connections everywhere, from shady mechanics like Jason to corrupt police officers, all the way up to higher-ups in various businesses who were part of the money laundering operation. But why had they targeted him? What was it about his car, his Mustang, that made him a target for such a dangerous group? Rick's report also revealed something disturbing. The Silver Serpents had been keeping a close eye on Keanu for some time. They knew about his love for classic cars and his attachment to his Mustang. Keanu realized that Jason might not have been the first victim of this syndicate. He might have been targeted specifically because of his high-profile status. The syndicate likely thought they could use his car to launder money or even sell it to someone with enough money to pay for the modifications. Keanu's thoughts were interrupted by a phone call from Rick. "Keanu, I found something," Rick said, urgency in his voice. "I managed to get a lead on one of the Silver Serpent's lower-tier members, a guy named Luis Ortiz. He's a middleman involved in a lot of the car swapping and selling. I've got an address. If you want to get to the bottom of this, he might be your best shot at finding out who's really behind this." Keanu's heart skipped a beat. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and this could be the break he needed. But it wouldn't be easy. Confronting someone like Ortiz could be dangerous, especially if he was connected to the Silver Serpents. "I'm going after him," Keanu said, determination in his voice. "Keanu, wait," Rick warned. "This could get ugly. You don't know what you're walking into." Keanu didn't hesitate. "I don't care. I need to know who's behind this. I need answers." The address Rick provided led Keanu to a rundown building on the outskirts. Town, hidden away in a maze of narrow streets and alleyways. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years, but Keanu wasn't fooled. He knew that criminals often used these kinds of locations to hide their operations, away from prying eyes. Keanu parked his car a few blocks away, making sure to stay out of sight. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but he knew it was likely to be dangerous. He had to be prepared for anything. He approached the building cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the silent street. The door to the building was slightly ajar, and Keanu hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and gasoline, and the dim light from a single bulb flickered overhead. Keanu crept through the dark hallways, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know if Luis Ortiz was inside or if he was walking into a trap, but he couldn't turn back now. He had come too far to back out. At the end of the hallway, Keanu spotted a figure standing near a workbench, his back to the door. The man was tall, with dark hair and a muscular build. Keanu didn't need to ask who he was. This was Luis Ortiz, the man who could answer all his questions. "Ortiz," Keanu called out, his voice steady but demanding. "We need to talk." The figure turned slowly, a cold smile spreading across his face as he recognized Keanu. Well, Ortiz said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Keanu Reeves, I didn't think I'd ever see you here. What's the matter? Did your precious car get a little too expensive for you?" Keanu stepped forward, his fists clenched. "I'm not here for games. I need to know who's behind the operation that's messing with my life. I need answers." Ortiz chuckled darkly. "You're in way over your head, Mr. Reeves. This isn't something you can just walk away from." Keanu narrowed his eyes, his anger rising. "Then I'll make sure I don't leave until I get what I came for." The tension in the air was palpable. Keanu's heart raced, his fists clenched, and his mind focused on one goal: get the truth. Luis Ortiz stood before him, exuding the confidence of a man who thought he was untouchable. The dim light cast harsh shadows across Ortiz's face, making his features look even more menacing. Keanu didn't flinch. He had come this far and wasn't backing down now. "You think you can intimidate me, Ortiz?" Keanu's voice was low, but the anger behind it was unmistakable. "I didn't come here for a fight. I came here for answers." Luis Ortiz smirked, clearly amused by Keanu's determination. "You don't understand, do you? This is bigger than you. You're just a pawn in a game you'll never win." Keanu stepped forward, ignoring the growing sense of danger in his gut. "I've been played long enough. Someone stole my car and used it for their own gain, and now I want to know who's at the top of this operation. Who's pulling the strings?" Ortiz's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "You're treading in dangerous waters, Reeves. The people you're looking for, you really don't want to cross them. They're not like the criminals you see in movies. These people are everywhere, and they've been doing this for years." Keanu wasn't backing down. "I'm done with games. I've been patient, but now I want names. You know who's behind this. You're connected, aren't you?" Luis Ortiz chuckled darkly. "I didn't get to where I am by talking to people like you. But I'll give you this much. You're smarter than I thought. You're right. I'm connected. But that's, as far as you go. You don't get to ask any more questions, Keanu. This is where it ends for you. A cold shiver ran down Keanu's spine, but he kept his ground. Ortiz's words were a threat, clear and unequivocal. The walls of the building seemed to close in, and Keanu felt a rising sense of dread. But he had come too far to back out now. I'll take my chances, Keanu said, his voice firm. Ortiz's eyes flickered with a hint of annoyance. You should have stayed away, but since you're so determined... He pulled a phone from his pocket and started typing, his eyes locked on. Keanu's instincts flared. Something wasn't right. Ortiz wasn't just texting. He was sending a signal, a warning. Before Keanu could react, the door behind him slammed shut, and the sound of footsteps echoed from every direction. Keanu spun around, his senses on high alert. The building wasn't as empty as he had thought. Ortiz had been expecting him. Luis Ortiz looked up from his phone with a mocking smile. You've just stepped into something much bigger than you realize. You're in the wrong place, Reeves. Now you get to face the consequences of your curiosity. Keanu's pulse raced. It was a trap. Before Keanu could even take a step back, two men appeared from the shadows, flanking him on either side. They were large, built like bouncers, their eyes cold and calculating. The last thing Keanu wanted was a fight, but it was clear that Ortiz had no intention of letting him leave unharmed. Keanu's mind raced. He wasn't a fighter by nature, but he had enough self-defense training to handle himself in a pinch. He needed to think fast. He couldn't let himself get caught in their trap. If he did, he would be at their mercy. Look, I'm not here to cause trouble, Keanu said, trying to buy himself some time. I just want to know who's behind the operation. That's it. Let me go, and we can walk away from this. Ortiz stepped forward, his grin widening. You really think they'll let you go after you've seen too much? You've been poking your nose in places where it doesn't belong. Now you'll have to deal with the consequences. The men on either side of Keanu moved closer, their eyes locked on him with malicious intent. Keanu could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. There was no way out, not without a fight. Keanu didn't hesitate. In a split second, he ducked under one man's arm, spun around, and landed a solid punch to the other man's stomach. The man grunted in pain, stumbling backward, but the other man lunged forward, grabbing Keanu's arm and twisting it behind his back. Keanu winced, but didn't give in. He kicked out with his leg, catching the man's knee and forcing him to lose his grip. With a quick twist, Keanu freed himself and took a step back. Ortiz was watching all of this with amusement, clearly entertained by the scuffle. Not bad, Reeves. You've got some fight in you, but it's not going to be enough. Keanu was outnumbered, but he wasn't giving up without a fight. He had to think of a way to escape. This was no longer about answers. It was about survival. Before the two men could close in again, Keanu spotted an old fire extinguisher on the wall. In a burst of adrenaline, he rushed toward it, grabbed it off the wall and swung it at one of the men. The metal canister connected with the man's head, and he crumpled to the ground. The other man hesitated, giving Keanu the opportunity he needed. He grabbed the man's arm, twisted it behind his back, and pushed him to the ground. The man hit the floor with a thud, knocking the wind out of him. Keanu stood over them, breathing heavily, his heart racing. He could hear Ortiz laughing from the sidelines, as if this was all some kind of sick game. But Keanu wasn't about to let it end here. I'm not playing your games anymore, Ortiz, Keanu said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. I'm taking this to the authorities. I'm done with you. Ortiz's smile faded and his eyes darkened. You think you've won, Keanu? This is just the beginning. You have no idea what you're up against. You've made a big mistake and now you're going to pay for it. As Keanu made his way toward the exit, the door swung open and a tall, imposing figure stepped inside. The man's face was partially obscured by shadows, but Keanu could see the glint of a gun in his hand. Ortiz straightened up, his demeanor shifting from casual to serious in an instant. Ah, there he is, he said with a cold smile. I think it's time for you to leave, Reeves. The figure stepped forward, his presence suffocating. Keanu's eyes darted to the gun, his body tensing. This wasn't over yet. Who are you? Keanu demanded, his voice firm despite the rising fear. The man didn't answer immediately. He simply stared at Keanu, his expression unreadable. Ortiz stepped aside, allowing the man to approach. "I'm the one you've been looking for," the man finally said, his voice low and menacing. "And you've been digging in places that were never meant to be uncovered." Keanu's stomach dropped. The person standing before him wasn't just anyone. This was the man at the top, the mastermind behind the Silver Serpents. The man in front of Keanu exuded a chilling aura of power, and Keanu could feel every muscle in his body tense. The gun in the man's hand glinted under the dim light, and the air around them seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. This wasn't just a criminal. This was the leader of the entire operation, the mastermind behind everything that had happened. Keanu didn't flinch. He had come too far to back down now. He had faced danger before, but this felt different. The odds were stacked against him, and yet his determination to get answers drove him forward. "I'm not afraid of you," Keanu said, keeping his voice as steady as he could despite the growing anxiety. "You think you've got everything under control, but you don't. I'm not walking out of here until I know who you are and why you've been messing with my life." The man's lips curled into a cold smile. "You really have no idea what you've gotten yourself into, do you, Reeves? You've been chasing shadows, poking at a hornet's nest that you should have left alone. But now, here we are." Keanu's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. The moment he had been dreading and anticipating all at once. The truth was finally within reach, but it came with a dangerous price. "I know enough to know that you're using people like Jason to do your dirty work," Keanu pressed, taking a step closer, determined not to let fear paralyze him. "But what I don't understand is why. Why me? Why my car? Why turn my life into one big mess?" The man studied Keanu for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. Then he chuckled darkly, the sound sending a chill down Keanu's spine. "You think it's about your car?" the man asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You think you're the only one who's been targeted? You're not special, Reeves. You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, but your car, that Mustang of yours, now that's a different story." Keanu's brow furrowed in confusion. "What does my car have to do with any of this? It's just a car." The man stepped forward, the gun still trained on Keanu. "It's not just a car, it's a symbol. A vehicle with a specific connection to a much bigger operation. We didn't steal it for the money, Reeves. We stole it for its value in a much larger scheme." Keanu's mind raced. "A much larger scheme? What did that even mean?" the man continued, his tone becoming more intense. "You see, your car is a part of an underground ring of high-value vehicles used for, let's just say, purposes far more profitable than you can imagine. This operation isn't just about stealing cars and flipping them. It's about laundering money, trafficking, and a web of corruption that runs deep into government, law enforcement, and beyond." Keanu's stomach dropped. His Mustang wasn't just a prized possession. It had somehow become a part of something far darker, something far more dangerous. "People like you," the man said, his voice now a low growl, "are nothing more than pawns. You were the perfect target because of who you are. Keanu Reeves, a celebrity, a well-known figure. No one would think twice about you getting involved in something like this. And when your car went missing, no one would suspect it had anything to do with us. You were an ideal cover-up." Keanu felt a wave of realization wash over him. His fame had made him a target, but not for the reasons he initially thought. His car had been stolen not for its value in the traditional sense, but as part of a larger, more complex criminal network. "You've been using my name, my reputation, to hide your operation," Keanu said, his voice growing more forceful. "You used me as a tool." The man's smile widened. "Exactly, and the best part? You walked right into the trap thinking you were just trying to recover your car, but now you're far too deep to get out without consequence." Keanu's mind was spinning. He was trapped in a world far beyond his control, tangled up in a criminal empire that seemed to have its claws everywhere. But there was one thing he knew for sure. This wasn't the end. He couldn't allow it to be. "I don't care how deep I'm in your little game," Keanu said, determination seeping into his words. "I'm going to take you down, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you've been doing." The man's expression shifted from smugness to something darker. "You think you can take me down? You think anyone will believe you when I'm done with you? You're just a man with a story, Keanu. A man who's gotten too close to the truth. And in our world, that's dangerous." Keanu stood his ground, refusing to back down. "I don't care about the consequences. I'll make sure the whole world knows what you've done. This ends now." The man's eyes narrowed, and for the first time there was a flicker of real anger behind them. He lifted the gun slightly, as if he was ready to end the confrontation right then and there. But before he could make a move, a loud bang echoed through the building, followed by the sound of footsteps rapidly approaching. The man's eyes darted toward the sound, and for a moment Keanu saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. "Who's there?" the man demanded, his grip tightening on the gun. Suddenly the door flew open and two uniformed police officers rushed in, their guns drawn. "Freeze! Hands where we can see them!" Keanu blinked in surprise. Had Rick tipped them off, or had they been tracking this place the entire time? Either way, this was the break Keanu needed. The man hesitated, clearly weighing his options. For a split second he seemed to consider running, but the police officers closed in quickly, forcing him to drop the gun. "Put your hands up! You're under arrest for theft, conspiracy, and a range of other charges," one of the officers barked. Keanu let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. This wasn't the way he had imagined things ending, but it was a win nonetheless. As the police took the mastermind away, Keanu couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and confusion. The answers he had gotten only led to more questions. The operation was vast, far-reaching, and beyond anything he had ever imagined. But at least now the mastermind was in custody. Rick appeared at Keanu's side, his expression unreadable. "You did good, Keanu. We couldn't have done it without you." Keanu glanced at the handcuffed man being led away. "But what now? This is just one person. There's a whole network out there. How do we take them down?" Rick sighed, his gaze serious. "We keep digging. We bring the whole thing down piece by piece. But for now, this is a big win. You've done more than you think." Keanu nodded, though a sense of unease lingered. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. There were still many pieces of this puzzle left to uncover, and Keanu knew he wouldn't stop until the whole operation was exposed for good. As the police took their prisoner away, Keanu stood there, watching them disappear into the night. He knew one thing for sure: this wasn't just about his car anymore. This was about taking down a criminal empire and making sure justice prevailed, no matter the cost. Keanu's heart still pounded in his chest as the police led the mastermind away, but the moment of triumph was short-lived. The weight of the situation began to settle in, and Keanu knew that this was far from over. The man they had just arrested might have been a key figure, but he wasn't the end of the road. The Silver Serpents were a vast operation, one that stretched deep into the underworld, and Keanu had only scratched the surface. Rick stood next to him, arms crossed, his eyes scanning the scene. "This is just the beginning, Keanu. We've taken out a major player, but the syndicate runs deep. We've only seen the tip of the iceberg." Keanu nodded, still processing everything he had learned. The mastermind's confession had revealed more about the true scope of the operation, but it had also left him with a growing sense of unease. The Silver Serpents weren't just a car theft ring. They were an organized criminal syndicate involved in money laundering, human trafficking, and connections to corrupt officials at every level. "What's next?" Keanu asked, his voice heavy with resolve. "We can't just stop here. We have to take down the whole operation." Rick turned to face him, his expression serious. "We'll need more intel, and we'll need help from the right people. The authorities are starting to take this seriously, but we're still fighting a battle with our backs against the wall. These guys have been operating in the shadows for years. It won't be easy." Keanu took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the fight ahead. This wasn't just about his car anymore. It was about exposing an entire network of criminals and dismantling an empire built on exploitation. And he wasn't going to stop until he saw it through. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and investigations. The police had gathered as much evidence as they could from the mastermind's confession, but there was still a lot of work to be done. Keanu and Rick had started piecing together the clues, but the deeper they dug, the more dangerous things became. One night, Keanu sat in his apartment, going over the documents they had recovered. There were names, addresses, and connections that seemed to lead everywhere, but something didn't add up. The mastermind had mentioned several high-profile figures in his confession, people with enough power and influence to protect the syndicate. As Keanu sifted through the information, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Rick. "I have someone who might be able to help us. Meet me at the diner in 30 minutes. Keanu didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket and headed out the door, knowing that whatever was coming next, it was going to be pivotal in bringing the whole operation down. When he arrived at the diner, Rick was already sitting at a booth sipping his coffee. A woman sat across from him, her face partially obscured by the hood of her jacket. She looked out of place, too young, too sharp to blend in with the usual crowd at the diner. Rick waved Keanu over. "This is Elena," he said, nodding toward the woman. "She's a hacker. She's been tracking the Silver Serpents for months, and she has information that could change everything." Keanu slid into the booth, offering Elena a brief nod. She didn't seem like someone who would normally work with law enforcement, let alone a celebrity, but Rick's word was enough to trust her, for now. "Nice to meet you," Keanu said. "So what do you have for us?" Elena leaned in, her eyes scanning the room before speaking in a low voice. "I've been monitoring communications within the syndicate for a while. They're careful, but they've made mistakes. I've found encrypted messages, bank transfers, and connections to people who should never be involved in something like this." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Are we talking about high-ranking officials?" Elena nodded. "Exactly. The Silver Serpents aren't just a bunch of street-level criminals. They've infiltrated law enforcement, politics, and even some of the most powerful businesses in the city. It's a network so deep that taking it down will be like dismantling a spider's web, one thread at a time." Rick's voice was tense, as he added, "And that's where we need your help, Keanu. We need someone with your influence to get us access to people who can make a real difference. People who can take down the system the Silver Serpents have built." Keanu looked at Elena, her sharp gaze meeting his. "You've been doing this for months. You've got the skills, but why are you getting involved with us? What's your stake in all of this?" Elena's expression hardened slightly. "I have my reasons," she said, her voice cold. "My brother was involved with them. I've been trying to find out who's behind everything for years, but every time I get close, they pull him back into their web. If I can take down the Silver Serpents, maybe I can finally get him out. Maybe I can make sure no one else gets dragged into their mess." Keanu felt a pang of empathy. This was no longer just about a stolen car. It was personal for Elena. She had her own reasons for wanting to bring down the syndicate, and Keanu could see that her passion for justice matched his own. "All right," Keanu said, his voice firm. "Let's do this. I'm in, whatever it takes." Rick nodded. "We're going to need everything you've got, Elena. If you've got access to their networks, we need to hit them where it hurts. We need information. We need people who can testify. And we need to make sure that when the walls start closing, in on them they can't escape." Elena's eyes gleamed with determination. "I've been digging for too long to stop now. We're going to bring them down, Keanu. We'll hit them so hard that they won't know what hit them." In the days that followed, the three of them, Keanu, Rick, and Elena, worked tirelessly to gather intel, formulate a plan, and prepare for the next phase of their mission. Elena's hacking skills were invaluable, allowing them to intercept messages, trace bank transfers, and track down high-ranking members of the Silver Serpents network. With Rick's connections and Keanu's influence, they began to piece together a strategy to take down the syndicate once and for all. But the more they uncovered, the more dangerous things became. They learned about secret meetings between corrupt officials and the Silver Serpents, underground auctions where stolen cars were sold to the highest bidder, and covert operations designed to launder money through legitimate businesses. Keanu knew that this was no longer just a fight to recover his stolen car. It was a battle for the soul of the city. The Silver Serpents had their claws in every corner, and if they were going to take them down, they would have to strike hard and fast. But time was running out. The deeper they dug, the more desperate the Silver Serpents became. Keanu knew that. They wouldn't go down without a fight. And if they were cornered, they'd do anything to protect their empire, even kill. The days were beginning to blur together for Keanu, Rick, and Elena. They were getting closer, inch by inch, to the heart of the Silver Serpent's operation, but each new revelation only added to the weight on their shoulders. It had become more than just a mission to stop a criminal ring. It had become a race against time, with lives hanging in the balance. They had gathered intel on the syndicate's key players, tracked down their hidden assets, and even started identifying their safe houses. But the deeper they went, the more they realized just how far-reaching and dangerous this network truly was. The Silver Serpents weren't just a car theft operation. They were a full-blown criminal empire with ties to international trafficking, money laundering, and corrupt politicians. And now it was all coming to a head. The Silver Serpents knew they were under attack. Keanu could feel the tension in the air. Everywhere they turned, danger seemed to be closing in on them. Elena's hacking had led them to a series of encrypted messages between high-ranking members of the syndicate. They were planning something big, something that would change the game entirely. "This is it," Rick said one night, his face lit by the glow of his laptop. "They're making a move tomorrow, a big one. We need to act fast." Keanu clenched his fists. "What's the plan?" Rick stood up, pacing. "We've pinpointed the location of one of their main storage facilities. It's located on the outskirts of the city, just beyond the industrial zone. They're meeting there tomorrow night. If we can infiltrate it and get the evidence we need, we can take down a significant part of their operation." "And what happens if we don't make it?" Elena asked, her voice calm but steady. She wasn't one to show fear, but even she knew this was a dangerous move. "If they're preparing for something big, they could be ready for us." Keanu felt his heart race. The thought of walking straight into the lion's den was nerve-wracking, but he also knew they didn't have any other choice. "We don't have a choice. We go in, get the evidence, and take them down, whatever it takes." Elena nodded, her fingers already flying over her laptop keyboard. "I've got access to their internal comms. I can listen in and feed you the information in real time. I'll give you the signal when it's time to make your move." Rick's eyes hardened. "And I'll be on the ground backing you up. We'll move in fast and we'll get out faster, but we'll need to move as a team, no mistakes." Keanu met Rick's gaze, then turned to Elena. "Let's make this count." The next night, the three of them stood in the shadows outside the Silver Serpent's facility. The building loomed ahead, surrounded by a chain-link fence and high walls. It was heavily guarded, but Keanu knew they had no choice but to push forward. This was the moment they'd been working toward for weeks. Keanu's pulse raced as they moved silently through the darkness, keeping low and out of sight. Elena's earpiece buzzed in his ear, her voice calm and focused. "They're still inside," she said. "The leader's meeting with some of his top people. I'm sending you the schematics of the building now." Keanu studied the map she sent him on his phone, memorizing the layout as quickly as he could. "We move in on the west side," he whispered. "That's where the least amount of security is. We'll have one shot at this." Rick gave a nod of approval, and they began making their way to the designated entry point. The night air was thick with tension as they carefully navigated their way past security cameras and guards. Keanu's thoughts were racing. Every move they made had to be precise. One mistake, and everything they had worked for would crumble. As they reached the side entrance, Rick signaled to Keanu. "This is it." Keanu took a deep breath, steadying himself. They were about to break into one of the most dangerous places they had ever been. He looked at Rick and Elena, both of them, as focused as ever. "We get in, get what we need, and get out." "Fast," Keanu said. They moved quickly through the door and into the building, the sounds of their footsteps muted by the thick concrete walls. Elena's voice buzzed in their ears, feeding them real-time information about the layout and the movements of the guards. "Second-floor storage room," Elena instructed. "That's where the files are. It's locked down tight, but I can help you get past the security system." Rick kept his hand on his weapon, eyes scanning every corner. Keanu's senses were on high alert, every sound amplified in his ears. They reached the stairwell leading up to the second floor. Keanu motioned for Rick and Elena to follow. "This is it," he whispered. They reached the top of the stairs and moved down the narrow hallway toward the storage room. Keanu's heart hammered in his chest, but he pushed down the fear, focusing on the task at hand. The door to the storage room was locked, but Elena's voice came through again. "I've hacked the security. You're good to go," Rick kicked. The door opened, and the trio moved inside. Rows of filing cabinets, stacks of documents, and computer servers filled the room. This was the treasure trove they needed to bring the syndicate down. Keanu moved toward the files, scanning through them quickly. "We need hard evidence, something concrete." Elena's eyes were glued to her screen. "I'm in their network. I can get you access to the classified files, but we need to move fast. They'll be here any minute." Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Keanu's stomach dropped. They had to move, and fast. "They're coming," Elena warned. "You have less than a minute." Keanu grabbed the first file he could find and stuffed it into his bag. "We've got what we need. Let's go." Rick led the way, and Keanu and Elena followed. The tension in the air was palpable as they made their way back to the stairwell. But as they reached the bottom of the stairs, they heard a loud crash. The door at the entrance to the building had been kicked open. "Cops, get down!" Rick shouted. Keanu's heart raced as the team scrambled for cover. There was no going back now. The Silver Serpents had figured out what they were up to, and they weren't going down without a fight. A firefight erupted as Keanu and his team ducked behind crates and equipment. The sounds of gunfire echoed through the building, and Keanu could hear the heavy footsteps of the syndicate's enforcers closing in. It was chaos. Every move had to be calculated. Every second counted. Keanu's mind raced as he tried to think of their next move. Then a shocking realization hit him. The man who had been helping them, Rick, had been too calm, too focused. Something didn't feel right. And then he heard a voice over the comms. "Keanu, you've done well to get this far, but this is where it ends." Keanu's blood ran cold. The voice belonged to Rick. The words echoed in Keanu's mind, a chilling realization that sent a cold wave of dread washing over him. Rick, the man he had trusted, the man who had been by his side throughout this entire journey, was behind it all. "Keanu, you've done well to get this far, but this is where it ends." Rick's voice crackled through the earpiece. For a moment, time stood still. Keanu's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His mind raced, searching for some kind of explanation. "Rick? But he helped us. He was with us the whole time." The sudden realization hit Keanu like a ton of bricks. The pieces were falling into place. Rick had always been one step ahead, his knowledge of the Silver Serpents too precise, his timing too perfect. What if it wasn't coincidence? What if Rick had been leading them into a trap from the beginning? "Rick," Keanu's voice was hoarse, as if he couldn't quite believe the words coming out of his own mouth. "What are you talking about? You're working with them?" Rick's voice came through the comms again, and this time there was no mistaking the cold, calculating tone that slipped into his words. "You've been too naive, Keanu. Did you really think that you could just waltz in and take down an operation? This big without consequences? The Silver Serpents aren't some small-time criminals. They've been running this city for years, and I've been working with them the whole time." Keanu's stomach dropped, his head spinning. His thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. All this time? He had never suspected Rick of being anything but a loyal ally. They had worked together, laughed together, and strategized for weeks. But now it was clear. The enemy wasn't just outside the walls. They were inside the team, too. Rick's betrayal wasn't just a punch to the gut. It was the worst kind of twist, one that threatened to unravel everything Keanu had worked for. His fists clenched, his blood boiled, but there was no time for anger. They were still under fire, and now the odds had shifted drastically. As the gunfire rang out through the building, Keanu's instincts kicked in. He knew they had to get out of there, but it wasn't just about escape anymore, it was about survival. Elena was still by his side, her face pale with shock, but her focus remained razor-sharp. "We need to move now," Elena urged, her eyes wide, with panic, but her hands steady as she grabbed Keanu's arm. Keanu nodded, shaking off the initial shock of betrayal. He couldn't afford to let this tear him apart, not yet. Rick had played his hand, and now Keanu had to play his own. "We'll make it out," Keanu said, determination creeping back into his voice. "We've got the files, and we're getting out of here." They moved quickly, darting between crates and equipment, all while the sound of footsteps and gunfire grew louder. The Silver Serpents were closing in, and Keanu knew they didn't have much time before they were cornered. Elena's voice crackled in his ear. "I'm setting up an escape route. We have to get to the east side of the building. There's a garage with an exit there. We'll have a chance if we can get to the cars." But as they rounded a corner, the worst possible scenario unfolded. A group of armed men, all wearing the distinctive insignia of the Silver Serpents, blocked their path. Keanu's pulse raced. They were trapped. There was no way out. "Don't move," one of the men growled, his gun aimed straight at Keanu's chest. "You're not going anywhere." Keanu's heart pounded in his ears, but his mind was clear. He needed a plan, and fast. "Elena," Keanu whispered into his comms, "can you get me that escape route now?" Elena didn't hesitate. "I'm on it, but it's going to take a second." As the Silver Serpents closed in, Keanu exchanged a glance with Elena. Without warning, he lunged forward, knocking the gunman's weapon aside with a swift movement. The man staggered back, his balance thrown off, but the others were already reacting, opening fire. Rick's voice crackled through the comms once more. "You're wasting your time, Keanu. It's over." Keanu didn't respond. Instead, he dropped to the ground, narrowly avoiding a bullet that whizzed past his head. Elena had already moved, taking cover behind a large crate. The two of them were pinned down, but Keanu was determined to fight. His way out. With a quick glance, he spotted the garage door to the east side of the building, just a few 100 feet away. It was their only shot. He grabbed Elena's arm, pulling her toward him. "We're going for it," he said, adrenaline surging through his veins. Now or never. With bullets ricocheting off the walls around them, Keanu and Elena sprinted toward the garage door. The sound of gunfire rang in their ears, but Keanu's focus was sharp. He could see the exit now, just a few more steps. "Go! Go!" Elena shouted, her voice full of urgency. As they reached the garage door, Keanu slammed his hand on the button to open it. The massive door began to rise, revealing an empty parking lot. But just as they thought they were home free, a familiar figure stepped into the doorway. It was Rick. The betrayal stung more than anything Keanu had ever felt. Standing in front of him, Rick's expression was cold, calculating. "You're not going anywhere." Elena took a defensive stance, but Keanu held up his hand. This wasn't just about getting away anymore. It was personal. "You really think you've won, Rick?" Keanu asked, his voice a low growl. "You've made your choice, but I'm not backing down." Rick smirked, his gun trained on Keanu. "You're already too late. There's no escape for you now." Keanu's gaze never wavered. He knew what had to be done. In a flash of movement, he lunged toward Rick, knocking the gun out of his hand in one swift motion. A struggle broke out, and for a moment it was a blur of punches and chaos. Keanu could feel Rick's strength, but his determination was stronger. With a final blow, Keanu knocked Rick to the ground, the fight over in an instant. But as Rick lay there, gasping for breath, Keanu didn't feel satisfaction, only a deep sense of betrayal. He'd trusted this man, and now he was nothing more than a criminal mastermind. "You won't get away with this," Rick spat. But Keanu knew it was too late for him. His empire was crumbling. Elena grabbed Keanu's arm, pulling him away. "Let's go, Keanu. The cops will be here any minute." With Rick down and their way clear, Keanu and Elena bolted out of the garage and into the waiting car, speeding off into the night. As they drove away from the chaos, Keanu's thoughts raced. The Silver Serpents were no more. Thanks to their efforts, the police had already been notified, and the evidence they had gathered would ensure that the criminal syndicate would crumble. But the victory felt bittersweet. Keanu had lost a friend, someone he had trusted deeply, and though justice had been served, the cost was far higher than he could have imagined. "Is it over?" Elena asked quietly, her voice tired but relieved. Keanu glanced at her, the weight of everything they had been through pressing down on him. "No, it's just beginning." Keanu's life would never be the same. The journey to take down the Silver Serpents had changed him, had revealed a side of the world he had never imagined. But with the syndicate broken, he could finally breathe again. There was still work to be done, but for now, the world was a little bit safer, And as the sun began to rise over the horizon, Keanu knew one thing for sure: he would never stop fighting for justice. The fight against corruption and evil never ended, but he was ready for whatever came next. Thanks for joining Keanu on this wild ride. Make sure to subscribe and follow along for more thrilling adventures. Justice never sleeps, and neither do we. Stay tuned for the next chapter in Keanu's journey.